It's been 5 minutes, so we're good.
Okay. When I spoke with Jerry and through him, members of the Adult Education Committee, I was asked to do a series of classes on Psalms, and within that, kind of a change from what I've been teaching, and within that, to work with Psalms. I said, do you want me to do Psalms that people know or Psalms that people don't know? And the feedback was, do Psalms that people know, and maybe try to do 2 Psalms in every class. So we Jews, of course, are most familiar with Psalms that are used regularly in the liturgy, in the Siddur, as well as a few which are common in other rituals, like those used at life cycle rituals, for example. There are a number of Psalms associated with funeral services. There are many ways in which we use Psalms in liturgy, and they're often found in groupings. For example, Hallel, or Kabbalat Shabbat, or the end of Psuke de Zimra. This is you guys on screen are a particularly sophisticated, educated community. So I'm going to use terms that I would normally translate, but if you don't understand something I'm saying, please stop me. So for this class, I thought that it would be interesting to use places where we have 2 Psalms that are used for the same purpose, and they alternate. I thought this would provide a convenient way for me to choose the text that I'm going to teach, as well as a bit of a mystery to solve, which would make it more interesting for me. Why are these 2 Psalms being used for the same purpose, and why is one being used in one place and one being used in another place? I should have known that it would not make my life any easier to do it that way. First, there is the challenge of teaching even familiar short Psalms with the constraint of the time that we usually give ourselves on a Zoom class. But in particular, the question of the past and current liturgical uses, and the history of tonight's pair, turned out to be a little more complex, actually a whole lot more complex than I had expected. So we'll see where we get with that. Before we start our actual learning for right now, I want to make a brief comment about studying Psalms. There are many, many different ways to study these texts, and I'm not going to use most of them. Detailed study of the Hebrew language, literary structure, poetic tools, parallelism, allusions, sounds, are all necessary and enriching and critical to our understanding of this poetry. But I can't do it all. And so for any of you that have been on a journey with Rabbi Malamit, particularly at the high holidays when he's been exploring Psalms in his particular way, you're going to think that we are doing a completely different kind of discipline. So for the most part in this series, I'm going to look at what we read on the page with a variety of translations, some traditional and modern commentary, and ways in which we can find these texts meaningful in our individual and communal lives, as well as their place in our everyday liturgy. For tonight's class, I've chosen the pair of Psalms which are used to introduce Birkat HaMazon in Ashkenazic practice. I will introduce the reason most often given for their use, and then spend time looking at each Psalm individually as a religious poem outside of and within the liturgy. And then at the end, try to go into a little more detail about the historical and theological sources for reciting these Psalms before Birkat HaMazon, or not reciting one of them in particular. So now we're going to make sure this works. Come on. There we go. Okay. So I'm sharing text day. I did send out an email with all of the texts, and if anybody didn't get that, I'm happy to, just let me know afterwards. But so you can either use them on what I sent you or what I'm showing up. So this should actually look familiar to many of you, because in many benchers, you will see a page that looks like this one prior to the Zimun, to the invitation to say grace. Side by side, or perhaps one page after the other, you're going to see Psalm 137, and the instructions are to recite this on weekdays, and Psalm 126, which we say on Shabbat, holidays, and joyful occasions, or technically, and you see that here in the introduction, on days when Tachanun is not said. So we have two alternatives. Seems relatively simple. One said on weekdays, and one said on holiday, Shabbat, and joyful occasions. But more frequently today, although it actually goes, this also goes way back, you may only see one of those Psalms. You may only see Psalm 126, Shir HaMalot, what we know as Shir HaMalot, and not also Psalm 137. Now, I have very deliberately used as the text here that I copied something from a bencher called Zmiros Yisrael, because I wanted you to see that it is not only conservative liturgy, conservative Sidurim, which are not including Psalm 137 anymore, but that in fact, many benchers and Sidurim in the Orthodox world are also not including Psalm 137 anymore. So in some ways, that's a first piece of the mystery, which I'm going to get back to you on. But in fact, I went to what is, I've been trying to track down why we do or don't say this, or this pair of Psalms. And I'm actually going to show you at the bottom of this page, or text C, is from the classic work of Rabbi Isaac Klein, the great conservative halachist, and his Guide to Jewish Religious Practice, published in 1974, in which he teaches, he says, before the actual grace is recited, an introductory psalm is said. On weekdays, we recite Psalm 137, Al Naharot Bavel, by the rivers of Babylon, to express our mourning for the destruction of Zion, an event which should not be forgotten even during our meals on Shabbat and during our meals, I guess. On Shabbat and festivals, we recite Psalm 126. In place of the sorrowful remembrance of past tragedies, it is an optimistic vision of the future rebuilding of Zion. Okay, so up until that point, and really almost till now, this is the authoritative statement of conservative Jewish practice. And he does say that we recite Psalm 137, and it's not in any conservative prayer books that existed at that time or exist now. And Rabbi Klein is giving what is basically the explanation for the two that you will find almost anywhere you look, which is we're supposed to remember something, during the week, we remember our mourning for the destruction of Zion. This is something we're supposed to remember all the time. And on Shabbat and festivals, we do remember it, but instead of remembering it with sorrow, we acknowledge it while looking forward to the future. Okay? For the moment, that is as far as I'm going to go on the history. Well, actually, I'm going to say one more thing or two more things. Okay, but then it's as far as I'm going to go. Reciting these Psalms is actually a new liturgical addition. And as you know, since it only dates back to the 16th century, it is a new liturgical addition in our prayers. And that's really the piece that we're gonna come back to later. But I also want to note that in general, Sephardim and Edot HaMizrach do not recite these Psalms. If they do anything at all, it is Psalm 23. So we're really talking about a new practice in the Ashkenazic communities. Okay, so do I want to share yet? Sure, in a minute. We're going to start with Psalm 137, and I have the feeling we're going to spend more time on that tonight. Parts of this psalm, I am assuming that you know very well, and parts of it you may not know well. You may have seen them and been so shocked that you simply blanked out on it. It's a psalm which does not play a prominent role in conservative liturgy. And given that it is, according to Rabbi Klein, something which we're supposed to be saying, it might be surprising that it doesn't appear in conservative Sidurim at all, in any contemporary conservative Sidurim, both here and, as far as I can tell, in Israel. But that is true that there's about 90 other psalms that also don't appear in our Sidurim. But its absence in some ways might or might not be kind of striking. I did give you, for those who either before or after this are going to look at the handout that I gave you, which is basically the same thing that I'm going to be zooming. I gave you numerous translations for each of the Psalms, not necessarily the most authoritative translations, like some people would have used Robert Alter or other kinds of Psalms. I used a variety of translations that I had easy access to, and I think it will make our point. Obviously, one way of studying Psalms would be to pay more attention to the translations. And that will be critical in when we study Psalm 126. But for the moment, I think we're going to basically start with one particular English translation, just because it's the one on the same page. I'm not going to take the time to read the Hebrew now, although it would be important, and there may be places where we're going to come back to the Hebrew. But I have so much that I want to share with you that I'm going to go right to the English. This is an English translation, I believe, by Rabbi Simcha Weintraub. So here we go. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat and we wept as we remembered Zion. Upon the willows on its banks, we hung up our harps, for there our captors demanded of us words of song. Our tormentors asked of us with joy, sing a song from the songs of Zion. But how shall we sing the song of Adonai on alien soil? If I ever forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its cunning. May my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth if I remember you not, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. Remind the sons of Edom, Adonai, about the day of Jerusalem. Remind those who said, raise it to its very foundation. Daughter of Babylon, it is you who are the annihilated one. Happy is the one who will repay you for all that you have done to us. Happy is the one who will grab your little ones, dashing them against the rocks. Okay, I have a translation from the new JPS. I have a translation from Martin Cohn, who's one of my favorite one-volume Psalms. I have a translation from a very traditional, kind of inspirational Hasidic thing, which Ellie got for her bat mitzvah. She left it here for some reason. But it's useful in some ways, right? May he who will grab your suckling child and smash it onto the rock be successful. Useful language, okay? So I'm gonna stop sharing. So I hope if we need to, I will, I'll open it up again. But I wanna be able to see if anybody has any thoughts or comments. We're focusing on the use of the full psalm in Birkat HaMazon, but where else do you know of the use of either this whole psalm or parts of the psalm? You certainly know, right? Im eshkachech Yerushalayim, right? So yeah, so where do you associate this psalm with? Anybody?
Tisha B'Av.
Okay, so Tisha B'Av in a particular setting, Fran, or just it seems like it should be there?
I just remember singing it when I was at Camp Masad.
And tell me what you sang.
Al Naharot Bavel.
Yep. So it isn't officially in liturgy for Tisha B'Av, but definitely it is found as part of most observances in many places on Tisha B'Av. Very much that particular song, that particular melody, probably Im eshkachech is also used. So obviously this is Tisha B'Av. This is Tisha B'Av, or this is the day after Tisha B'Av, right? We'll come back to when it is. When else do you associate this, any part of this psalm with that? Sharon?
It's extremely popularized in popular music. Metis Yahoo has done Jerusalem, If I Forget You. And also even in reggae, Bob Marley has a song by the rivers of Babylon. So it's been taken out of just the religious context and put into other cultural contexts as well that are, and frankly, okay. I think of those right away.
Right, and you can probably even, you're going to hear me periodically. I'm going to translate. How can we sing the Lord's song? And
yeah.
I want to come back to that issue of the music and the use in a moment. Gittel? Yeah.
So when you take it out of context too, when I was a kid and Israel became a state and I was in a Zionist camp, we used to pledge to the Israel flag, after the American flag, Im eshkachech Yerushalayim tishkach yemini. And so it was taken on by Zionists as a pledge. I don't think it stayed on as a pledge to the flag in Israel, but we did it as, in 1948.
That is fascinating. And I want to keep that in mind also as we look at 126. Everybody's missing a really what I think of as a big thing. Joanne?
Part of the wedding, eshkachech is pulled into the wedding ceremony.
Right. So if I forget you, right, as part of the wedding ceremony, where in the wedding ceremony?
Breaking the glass.
Breaking the glass, yeah. So we all know, again, sometimes we all know what isn't true, but we all know that when we break the glass at the wedding, we say this is to remember Jerusalem, and that we're fulfilling an obligation that which goes back to the Talmud and is not actually related to this particular psalm directly, but the idea that we should have been in complete mourning all the time since the destruction of the temple. We shouldn't drink wine. We shouldn't eat meat. We shouldn't. But then they said, well, because they offered meat, they offered wine. Well, then one of the rabbis in the Talmud says to the people who are mourning, but then you can't drink water either, right? because they offered water libations in the temple, right? So it becomes a way, how do we balance our lives in this eternal mourning when we have to go on and we live? And the wedding becomes a particular moment, the kind of the classic moment, since the wedding is the classic joy, and it is remembered specifically in the Talmudic text. We do something to reduce our joy a little bit. And it has become the custom to allude to this statement, Im eshkachech Yerushalayim. And now most often, if you're at a wedding and there's a chazan or there's a friend who sings or whatever, you know, at this moment before they break the glass, somebody will sing Im eshkachech Yerushalayim, right? Or the whole congregation will. It's not part of the liturgy. It's not. I went to check the Orthodox Rabbi's manual as well as our own. It's not part of the liturgy, but don't tell anybody that. So that's those are certainly significant places where that psalm is part of our life, or verses of that psalm are part of our life. By the way, another custom is that the bridegroom puts ashes on his forehead, and we don't see that too much, but I did go to a cousin's wedding where they did that, and also before he went down the aisle, and they might recite that, and it's also connected to if I don't put Jerusalem arosh simchati, right, at the forehead, at the front of my joy. So it plays itself out in a number of places. One other place that it is found is in a series of psalms for healing called Tikkun Klali by Rabbi Nachman, associated with Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, and it's explicated in this beautiful collection, Healing of Soul, Healing of Body, by that's put together by Rabbi Simcha Weintraub, which is why I think the translation is his. Amy Eilberg actually wrote the essay. It's one of those. 137 is one of the 10 in this cycle. Amy Eilberg wrote the explication of it, in which illness becomes the enemy and the suffering. It's a very beautiful essay. Okay, so now I want to get back to the question of music, because it is very ironic that a psalm whose premise is we cannot sing becomes the subject of so much music, Jewish music, but also Christian secular music. And I'm trying to find, some of you are more musical than I am, because the melody that Fran sang, Al Naharot Bavel, don't know if it is the same melody as one going back to, I think, 1780 by Philip Hayes, a Christian writer, a melody that was brought back by the Weavers, by Don McLean. By the waters of Babylon, right? I don't know if it's the same or not. Help, Michael, anybody? Or if Al Naharot Bavel is different. In my head, I'm trying to hear two people singing them at once, and I may have actually heard a setting with the English and the Hebrew together.
Solomoni Rossi has a setting of it. I can't bring the melody to mind. Off the top of my head. It was also put to music, only part of it though, by at least two Renaissance composers, Christians, and they stop at verse 4. They stop right before Meshkachech Yerushalayim. They just
right. We're going to see a number of different places where people stop the psalm, and certainly musically, it's not uncommon musically to only do part of a setting. One of the most interesting pieces, which I just heard recently, is by Will Butler, who might be part of Vampire Weekend or something like that. I don't really know his work, but Google this. He wrote it in 2015 after reading about the destruction of the museum in Mosul, in Iraq, actually. And if you listen to that, it's a setting of the full psalm. To me, emotionally, it really is perhaps the most accurate. The other ones are really pretty. This is not pretty. This is what I think the Levites would have sounded like if they were were singing. So you might want to look for that.
Stephanie, who was that again?
A person named Will Butler. And it was written in 2015. So you might want to, it's really hard to listen to. It's really painful, actually. But anyway, it's just that great irony that the words of the psalm are how can I sing? And yet it calls out so much Jewish music and other music. Okay, so we'll get back to the kind of a quick assessment. I told you this is like an impossible task, and I could have done once I started looking, I could have done the whole hour on this. I could do the whole hour on 126, and I could do the whole hour of the question of what it's doing in Birkat HaMazon. But here we go. So traditional reading, people who read the Psalms very traditionally and claim that David HaMelech wrote all of the Psalms, every single one of them, will tell you that that David HaMelech was given prophetic vision by God, and was able to write this psalm not only seeing the first destruction, but also seeing the second destruction of the temple. And the reason they say that is because the psalm refers to both Bavel and Edom. I'm going to refer to Edom in two different ways, but Edom is one of the names that the rabbis use for Rome. And so they can kind of justify this. Of course, this is all done before his son Solomon has even built the temple, but we're not going to worry about that. Most of the traditional as well as modern scholars hold that this psalm was written after the destruction of the first temple. That seems kind of obvious. But exactly when was it written? Possibly, maybe a first reading is that it was written immediately after they arrived in Bavel. When they first set down after this forced march that we can imagine them taking into exile. And the Midrash describes that the captors would not let them sit down. They wouldn't let them weep. And so it wasn't until they arrived at the waters, at the rivers of Babylon, at the edge of Babylonia, where Jeremiah actually left them, according to these Midrashim, leaving them to weep even further. So it is at that moment that they sat down and they wept. Of course, very early at the beginning of some kind of trauma, we often can't even weep, let alone have words with which to describe what we're experiencing. So it's only in that moment when they have kind of arrived, sat down by the rivers, that they're able to write this song, write these words. It's also possible that we could read Yashavnu slightly differently, right? The word Yoshev can be to sit, and it can also be to dwell. So it's possible that the psalm was written a little bit later when they had settled a little bit in Bavel. They were a little more stable, and what that does is make the exile more real, right? It no longer is a dream. We'll come back to dreams in the next psalm, but it's no longer something happening in a fog. They realize we have sat, we have lived, we have dwelt here, and we're not at home. And so now they have the perspective to be able to write this psalm. There are also suggestions that it's written after the return from Babylonia, but to me the language is so raw that it's hard to imagine being written any time other than something at the beginning of this experience of exile. Okay, the rivers, I'm not really going to do this consecutively or in detail on every verse. I just can't. But I wanted to make some comments on the idea of the rivers of Babylonia. the rivers, the waters of Babylonia are famous, or at least what's famous, right? It was one of the 10 wonders of the world, or 7 wonders of the world, were the verdant, green, hanging gardens of Babylonia. And you can imagine this as being such a shock, or even the idea of multiple rivers, right? Because the Israelites, the Levites, are coming from Israel, from Jerusalem. We do not think of Israel as being a place filled with waters, right? We'll come back to the Afikim, to the streams in the desert, when we look at the next psalm. But Israel is a dry place. Rain only comes in certain seasons. So even this beginning, Al Naharot Bavel, you get a sense of already the contrast. But they're not really tempted by these waters. These waters are alien to them, rather than being comforting or something that they desire. The next, or one of the next verses, describes them hanging up their harps, kinor, their harps, in the willows. Interestingly, Again, I haven't had time to research even all the translations. The new JPS translation, which is often our classic translation, talks about the poplars. It's the only translation I've seen talking about poplars rather than willows. So there has to be a reason, because the new JPS translation is not a casual translation. But I think the willows is much stronger for lots of different reasons. Because when we hear the word willows, right? Of course, we imagine willows by the river, right? That makes a lot of sense to us. But when we think about willows, we think about Sukkot. We think about, the lulav, and even more, we think about Simchat Beit HaShoeva. If we're thinking like Levites, right? The water festival, the water drawing festival that happened during Sukkot, which was characterized by the Levites singing and joyful dancing and the most wonderful thing, and people walking around with willows. And so the contrast here, right? Dafka, it's the Levites who are putting their harps into the willows so that they can't be played. Because of course they would have been played so much during the season of Sukkot. They hung them up, or perhaps they hid them in the willows so that they would not or could not play them. We don't know whether they wanted to play, because we do know that there are instruments that we play when we're sad, right? Instruments that we use to sing sad songs. But the sense here is the Levites can't even bear to do those songs. And so they put away their their harps in the willows, or perhaps they're hiding them. Because the captors come and say, sing us the joyous songs. And they say, how can we? We don't have our harps, and we don't have our instruments. We don't have the things which allow us to play. They say, how can we sing the Lord's song, or the songs of Zion, in the land of strangers? The Midrash, which is quoted by Rashi on his commentary of Psalms, connects this inability to play with the loss of the use of the right hand. And the right hand, of course, I guess, is the instrument that you would use to pluck the strings. But the loss comes violently. In the Midrash imagines that the Levites smashed or even bit their fingers off. Right hand, bit their fingers off, their thumbs off, so that they could not play. They were not lying, they literally could no longer play. And I think that sense of self-imposed violence, right? Punishment of one's body in this state of mourning. I've been having nightmares ever since I read this, this piece by Rashi and found it in the Midrash. But I think that sense of self-destructiveness is a response to trauma. The Midrash praises them, right? They make it impossible to sing for the captors, right? But really it is such an expression of trauma, to hurt oneself in this way, to make it impossible to do that which is normal. One of the things that someone had recommended to me, I'll actually be real honest. I sent a note to the rabbis discussion group, the Ravnet, and asked people to talk to me about their experience with Psalm 137. And did they say it in Birkat Hamazon? I was curious. Had they ever said it? Did they choose not to say it? We're going to come back to that issue. But one of my colleagues recommended, and I'm going to recommend this to you, Rabbi Eli Spitz, who's done a lot of writing. But if you Google him and Google Psalm a day, apparently for the last year or so, he's been doing a project of teaching a psalm, whether it's every day or whatever. He has a magnificent presentation on Psalm 137. And part of it is he shares and interviews and discusses the psalm or parts of the psalm with Rabbi Eddie Feinstein. Some of you may know Eddie as well. He's out in California, another important writer, both books for young adults and teenagers, as well as grown-ups like us. And so as part of that, I heard this, I'm going to share two teachings by Eddie, but it's a wonderful, it's a 50-minute presentation, but worth it. So Rabbi Eddie Feinstein suggests a powerful reading of the question, how can we play God's song in the land of strangers? And Eddie says this is the essential question, both for the Jews in Babylonia throughout the last 2,000 years and for us as well. The question of the diaspora. Can there be authentic Jewish songs, authentic Judaism outside of the land of Israel? Okay, Gittel, where's Gittel? There you go. Gittel, you spoke about this pledge, right? This Zionistic pledge, but the question of can there be authentic Judaism? Can we really sing Jewish songs? Was real in Babylonia, and it's been real ever since. And it's a new challenge to us because, in fact, we have made authentic Judaism for the last 2,000 years outside the land of Israel. But it's a whole different way of reading that verse. How can we sing the Lord's song? So I thought that was fascinating. There's another fascinating reading on Im Eshkachech that's found in the Midrash and then expanded in Hasidic writing. When we get to the line, Im Eshkachech Yerushalayim, if I forget you, Jerusalem, it's not, the speaker is not a Levite, and the speaker is not the Jewish people. The speaker of that line is God. Right? It is God, the Shekhinah, who has gone into exile with us. And we're going to come back to that, hold that in mind when we get to the history of why these Psalms are done. Or it is God promising to remember Jerusalem, to remember us, even at the point where the psalmist, and perhaps we also, feel that God has chosen not to invoke the power of the right hand of God by allowing the destruction of the temple and the suffering of the exile. But we hold on to that divine oath, not to forget Jerusalem. A fascinating reading of that line, okay? Ad Kan, up until now, I think this is a psalm you know. It's a psalm that you can be comfortable with, even identify with the suffering and the pain, the inability to sing. But then we get to verses 7, 8, and unbearably to 9. And we're troubled. we're more than troubled. We don't say this psalm. Okay, that's, the rest of this psalm is one response to these lines. Are we able to tolerate passive resistance, but not to see the curses in the second half of the psalm as part of our spiritual legacy and beliefs? Or are there ways to hear and understand and learn from these verses? Do we think that the second half of this psalm should not be recited anymore as part of public liturgy? One of the things I learned ironically this morning is that was one of the decisions of the Vatican Council, I think the Second Vatican Council, not to recite the final lines of this psalm in public liturgy. And apparently that is also the case in the Anglican Church. So that's interesting. The literary reality is that there are many calls for vengeance in the Psalms. What is it that makes the second half of this psalm so awful? Or is it really not necessarily the whole second half, but the last line about dashing the little ones against a rock? The editor of the Psalms made a deliberate choice to include this verse. How are we supposed to read it? I think there's a lot of other challenges in the second half of this psalm, but are we allowed to pass judgment on the author of this psalm who saw the destruction of the temple, or on some of the survivors of the Holocaust? But do their children and grandchildren have the right to make the same kind of statements? Are these cries for vengeance, or are they calls for justice? What do we as individuals and as a nation do with our righteous rage? Do we hide it and let it come out only in the second half of the Seder after everyone is tired from the meal, right? Remember, that's the other place where we raise this question of what it means to call for vengeance when we open the door for Elijah. What is the strength of the root Zohar, which is found a number of times in the second half of the psalm as well as in the first half of the psalm? Who is being reminded and for what purposes? The use of the word ashrei appears twice at the end of the psalm, happy, right? It's striking to have the word happy used in such a violent context, and particularly because ashrei is such a significant word in the book of Psalms. It's the opening word of the book of Psalms. So it's really interesting. Who was Edom? I said before that Edom was Rome, right? It's often identified as Rome. But Edom is also associated with Esau. And Esau is our brother, right? Does pain inflicted by those closest to us hurt us even more than those that can be attributed, pain that can be attributed to strangers? Who's being addressed in these verses and who is being called to act? My first tendency was to try to just, maybe I'll avoid these lines or sort of refer to them without really paying attention. But I think the studying I did and the reading made me want to really address them and raise the issues here. I'm going to end this psalm with another fascinating insight from Rabbi Eddie Feinstein, which might also lighten the atmosphere a little bit as we try to get into the next psalm. Rabbi Feinstein suggests that these final verses are actually the revenge of the Levites. He says that they were commanded to sing a song, and they do. In Hebrew, and with one of the joyful melodies, they sing the last three verses of this psalm. But the Babylonians don't know Hebrew, but they love the melody. And it is the Babylonians who walk through the streets of their cities, singing of their own impending destruction. And that is a form of vengeance. Take a deep breath.
I like that.
I'm gonna plow through. I know I'm not really giving a whole lot of time for talking, but I told you this was hard. I'm hoping the other two sets are actually not going to be as difficult. Psalms can be as difficult or easy as you want, but these have been challenging, and even the material that we're going to get to at the end about why we're saying them, or perhaps not saying them, is really interesting and different. So let's quickly, I'm going to share quickly one more time, or well, more than one more time, but let's see. So of course the other psalm, the one that we all love, and we know so many melodies to it, and we're happy to sing it, and we do. We sing it at weddings, and we sing it on Shabbat, and we sing it on holidays. Shir Hamalo b'shuv Adonai et shivat Zion hayinu kacholmin, right? And here I am going to read two different English translations, and I want you to listen closely to the difference. Okay, so the first is what's printed in Lev Shalem, our the new conservative Siddur. A song of ascents. When Adonai returned us to Zion, we were like dreamers, our mouths filled with laughter, our tongues with song. The nations said, how Adonai has raised them up. Adonai did raise us up, and we were happy. Make our return, Adonai, like the stream suddenly gushing in the Negev. May those who sow with tears harvest with song. In tears, the sower walks back and forth, carrying the basket of seed. May the farmer return, carrying the harvested sheaves, singing. Okay, another translation is what am I doing? I'm doing the new JPS translation. Here we go. When a song of ascents, when the Lord restores the fortune of Zion, we see it as if in a dream. Our mouths shall be filled with laughter, our tongues with songs of joy. Then shall they say among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord will do great things for us, and we will rejoice. Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like watercourses in the Negev. They who sow in tears shall reap in joy, with songs of joy. Though he goes along weeping, carrying the seed bag, he shall come back with songs of joy, carrying his sheaves. Okay, what's the, I'm going to stop sharing so I can see you. And what is the significant difference between those two translations? Anybody catch it?
The verb tense.
Yeah, Jerry, somebody else?
I think Joanne said it.
Yeah, it's a question of time. Is this past? When we returned to Zion, here's how we felt, here's what happened, here's what we experienced, or is it when we will return, when God will return us? Hebrew grammar, and I'm not even going to let Susie get started on this, but you know, the Hebrew verbs in the Bible do sort of have a sense of past, present, future, but they really don't, and often they can be used interchangeably. This is one psalm where it matters. Is this something which has already happened, or is this something which is going to happen? And that can make a great deal of difference theologically, or perhaps not. And so when we think about the psalm and when we read it, we have to keep that in mind. Let me just see where I am. Okay. Okay. Is this something that happened, or is this in the future, and we can anticipate how we will feel? We can anticipate what it'll look like, but it hasn't happened yet. So this psalm is used to introduce Birkat HaMazon, as you know, it's what brings us here. And it also appears as part of the cycle of 15 Shirei HaMa'alot psalms that are recited on Shabbat afternoon as we both seek comfort and look forward to redemption. And it was sung by the Levites these 15 Psalms were sung by the Levites. Guess what holiday? At Simchat Beit HaShoeva, at the water drawing in Sukkot. So although it seems at first that these Psalms have very little in common, we are going to see, in fact, that there are really some deep connections between the two, even though one seems to be a dirge of mourning and one is a statement of hope. It's often used as a celebration of the state of Israel, of occasions in the state of Israel. And the late Reuven Hammer writes, if I can read my writing, writes the founding of the state of Israel in modern times made this psalm more meaningful than at any time since it was composed. Okay, there is something very immediate for us as Jews who live in the time of the establishment of the state of Israel. Some of you were alive at that moment originally, and some of you, we have simply grown up with that reality. But on the other hand, that's why when Gittel said, Im Eshkechech Yerushalayim, right, that was the pledge that they said. And in my head, I'm thinking, no, you're supposed to be singing Shir HaMalot. But this rejoicing, this coming back to Israel, but it works either way. But Rabbi Martin Cohn in his commentary acknowledges the joy of this return, although he actually translates, I think he translates sorry. Cohn does translates for the future, when we will be brought back. But Rabbi Cohn understands this for modern Jews, especially in the in the context of the establishment of the state of Israel. He understands that this psalm really is a challenge to us if we take it as a representation or a statement of God's active hand in history. Okay, because this psalm asks us to say, does God actually act in history? Particularly for those of us living post-Holocaust and then establishment of the state of Israel. Were the tears of the Holocaust necessary for the plants and the growth of Israel? It becomes a very, again, even this one was supposed to be simple is not quite as simple and straightforward or simplistic as you might think. Most scholars seem to think that it was composed, forget David, of course David could have had prophecy and composed it too, but it was, that was composed upon the return from Babylonia. And so it does represent kind of that experience. And perhaps for the writers of this psalm, it is not when God will return us, but it really was when God brought us back. This was the experience. So I want to just explore again a couple of ideas that come up in the psalm. What is it like to be dreamers? What is the dream? It seems to be a necessary part of the return, this dream. But the events go back and forth from suffering to exile to return. In a dream, often time isn't quite so clear, right? And even those of us that saw, in some ways, the establishment, the settlement, the whatever, the development of Israel, there's still a dream-like quality, right? Think about your images of 67. Right? There's a dreamlike quality to what happened, and we're learning that there were parts of Israeli history that we didn't see in those dreams. We're having to constantly reinterpret this dream. But what is the dream? Right? Is the dream the returning, or is the dream the exile and the suffering? Right? Now that we are back, has the exile and suffering become like a dream that we can wake up from, right? Or is the return the dream. When we dream, we're hungry. Let's say in your dream you're hungry and you have something to eat. You have a wonderful feast in your dream. But when you wake up, you're still hungry. You're still thirsty. You didn't actually eat anything. But this is a different kind of dream, right? Because when we wake from this dream, or when we come from this dream, our mouths are full, right? Our mouths are full with joy. They're full with song. So it is a different kind of dream. I have to do it this way. Okay. All right. And again, the importance of song, right? The connection between these two. Tongues, what they can do, what our mouths can do, what they can produce, what they can't produce, and the meaning of song. A couple of other things I want to point out before I get to the history of these prayers. We'll go till about 9:15. I'm watching the clock. Or 8:15 for those of you on Central Time. So it's interesting, this line, Higdil Bagoyim Higdil Adonai Lasotim Ela, right? It's quite interesting. The nations will recognize God's action in bringing us back. And it is such a classic Jewish line, right? What will the Goyim say? And it sort of doesn't matter to us. It's as if we need non-Jews to affirm our experience, even in this situation. It's kind of an interesting observation. Whether you read the first part of the psalm or in the past or the future, the second half really is a much more unfinished reality. We need to return so we can have this laughter, or we'll back, but it's not quite complete yet. It's not secure. We're still asking for the afikim, these dry beds, which fill suddenly in the winter. We use that image often as an image of abundance. And the psalmist is also seeming to be asking for, bring this redemption immediately, let it come suddenly, let it come. But we need to remember that this image of afikim is an image of danger, okay? And almost every year in Israel, sometimes more than one hiker drown when these wadis suddenly flood. So there is a danger in things happening too fast. There is a danger in sort of waiting for the rush without being prepared, without being, I think there's a warning in this. I have to think about it, but there's a warning in that. The psalm is also used by individuals as a personal reflection on recovery for illness. There's a hint in the word for dreamers, because the word for dreamers is chomim, but the root may also be connected with the word choli for illness and also for healing. That this can be a personal psalm. Rabbi Sam Shield, the late rabbi in Newton, Massachusetts, wrote a beautiful book, For Thou Art With Me, in which he uses a series of psalms to reflect on his experience of illness and recovery. And so he speaks very movingly about that image, what it means to be exiled, and then to return and recover in whatever way that will be for us or for our loved ones. There was a really unusual and original reading of the psalm by Rabbi Miriam Glazer in a book which she wrote called Psalms in the Jewish Liturgy. She's a professor. She was originally a professor of liturgy, then of literature, and then she also got her rabbinic ordination. She actually co-authored a really wonderful cookbook with her sister on Jewish holiday cooking. But she has a beautiful reading of this psalm, because she takes it to a place beyond just the return to Zion, into a place of complete well-being, where the human being is connected to the land and to agriculture, that God has heard our prayer for well-being and has watered the earth, and our seeds can grow and become food. And in that moment of our blessing for Birkat Hamazon, we kind of bring together God and human beings and the land and the natural world, and they're all in a certain kind of harmony. It's a beautiful essay and reading. Okay, so having introduced you and hopefully challenged you to reread and relearn these Psalms, which you may have thought that you knew, the question is, for the next 10 minutes or 8 minutes or whatever, is what in the world are we doing reading these Psalms, and why, and where does it come from, and why is at least one of them controversial, and so it's actually kind of complicated. That reason given by Rabbi Klein, which you'll read in lots of places, is we're supposed to think about our exile, think about destruction of the temple and mourn it somehow, and then also look forward and rejoice on Shabbat. But it's not quite that simple. And as I said, it's a relatively new, the use of these Psalms, not the idea that we should remember, right? Because we know that goes all the way back. And we do remember in so many ways, but the use of these Psalms specifically before Birkat Hamazon, what are they doing there? And so there's a whole progression which goes a progression which starts in Pirkei Avot. It's in the Mishnah, it's in the Talmud. I referred to the kind of the wedding teaching about the idea. Pirkei Avot also talks about the idea that when three sit at the table, they have to talk Torah. But why do they have to do that? Because the table becomes the replacement for the altar. Okay, so now what happens at the table is significant. Still doesn't get us to the Psalms. But so just imagine 1,500 years or 1,300 years of this kind of discussion. And what you will sometimes see is that, now I just have to get to the right place. Come on, share. All right, what you will see sometimes quoted in giving the history of why Dafka we do these Psalms is a reference to the Zohar. Okay, the Zohar are attributed to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but really probably edited by Moshe de Leon, who lived from 1250 to 1305. And you'll see this reference. Why do we say these Psalms? Well, it goes all the way back to the Zohar and Truma. Whoever is enjoying his table and enjoying these foods should be sure to mention and express concern for the holiness of the Holy Land and for the temple of the king, which was destroyed. For this sadness he expresses over his table during happy and festive meals he is having there. The Holy Blessed One considers it as if the person had rebuilt God's temple, right? Nothing there about these particular Psalms, although you'll also often see this as the proof text for why we say them. It's a proof text for why we have to remember, that we are supposed to remember, but there is a place where we remember the temple, I guess you could say, because we say Bonei Yerushalayim, right? We have the bracha that God, please rebuild Jerusalem. But and here's where I haven't done the research because I wasn't expecting it to be this complicated. And truthfully, on the little bit of research I've done, I don't know, right? So this is, in most people will tell you, I'm going to show you somebody who disagrees, but most people will tell you the first appearance of the halacha that you should say Psalm 137. Oh, and by the way, also Psalm 126 is in Shar HaOtiot by Rabbi Joseph Horowitz. He started out in Prague, I think. He was born in 1652. That date doesn't look right. Probably 1680. Somehow I have the dates wrong there. I'll fix them up. In any event, he's in that generation, and he ended up in Sfat. Okay, so this comes within the context of the mystical communities of Sfat, adding all kinds of things there. But he is describing what is already a custom, right? For this reason, which is the reason that's in the Zohar, that we're supposed to remember the temple, right? For this reason, we are accustomed to recite on the rivers of Babylon before the grace after meals, especially since the table is in place of the altar. But in our many sins, the altar itself is no longer in existence, so he should recite 137. Because we've been exiled from the table of our father, but on Shabbat and Yom Tov, we say the psalm, when God returned the mourners to Zion. Okay, returned us to Zion, 126. Okay, but this is already an established custom, right? And I can't really seem to find the origin of this custom. And it seems pretty clear that 137 was first by the waters of Babylon, and then people felt like, oh, that's too down, too depressing for Shabbat, and so we really kind of look for something happier for Shabbat, and we get 126. Although we've seen how it actually is, both of them are really kind of appropriate for the table. So one of my colleagues, who does know, Rabbi Meyer Fierstein, who really is an expert in kind of this area, sent me a note, and he said the first source to state the recitation of these psalms is a requirement is Elijah Devidas, in 16th century Sfat also, but earlier than Rabbi Horowitz, and he gives the citing, but Rabbi Fierstein tells us, and this takes us back to something I mentioned near the beginning, both psalms refer to the Shekhinah, and that's why they were chosen, right? Psalm 137 refers to the Shekhinah in exile. Remember, I suggested that reading, if I forget you, Jerusalem, right? I is God, which I love that connection because it came from someplace else. And Psalm 126 refers to the Shekhinah coming out of exile on Shabbat and festivals. This is not Zionist. This is much more mystical in a much more technical sense. Most of the readings that you're going to see, or the explanations you're going to see, are going to be about returning to the land of Israel. Yes, we're sorry the temple is destroyed, but really it's the Zionist, even if without being the political Zionist return. Okay, so 1 or 2 more minutes. I said that I asked my colleagues, almost nobody remembered ever saying it. Nobody grew up saying it. Mom, I talked to Mark. He has no memory of anybody ever saying it. I actually checked with my son-in-law, who's in all these different pieces of the Orthodox world, and he said, I know it's on the page. It's on the bencher. That the bencher I copied was my son and daughter-in-law's, my daughter and son-in-law's bencher, which has both psalms on it. He said, it never at YU, never in the more right wing, never in Israel, did he ever actually see somebody say this psalm in that world. So why not? Why not? Lots of good reasons, maybe, or not at all. And one reason is it's just too long. Birkat Hamazon is already long enough on weekdays. Right? Shabbat, we have time to sit. And truthfully, that might or might not be a good reason. Another reason is because it's new, right? I talked to you about that piece of being new. And that may be one of the reasons why it's not part, it comes after the Shulchan Aruch. 35 years after the Shulchan Aruch is the first times it's mentioned. And it's not part of Sephardic practice, also indicating that there's something new about it. But if you say it's too long, or if you say it's new, but we do say Psalm 126, we don't say 137 during the week. Really, that's it may be in bencher still, but it's not in practice. And the question is actually being asked officially. Susie, you actually worked on a bencher. You edited a bencher. I forget, which does have, even though it's a contemporary and from a woman's perspective, but with perfect grammar, it does actually, it's a modern contemporary Orthodox bencher. It has both. But in a piece by Daniel Landis, and I think he's Rabbi Daniel Landis, and he's representing other people, he argues for not, you'll see actually who he addresses this to. He argues for admitting that we're not saying Psalm 137. He says we should continue to study 137 for its pretensions of the nightmare scenario that we experienced and re-experienced in our long and often said history. Nevertheless, it and its concluding verse is not necessarily halachically and in fact pedagogically dangerous at this volatile stage of life for the Jewish people. It will remain for students of Tanakh to learn and for people to recite. We just need the bencher industry to drop it from its side position to Shir Hamalot on Shabbat. So there you have it. And I don't have the power, I don't have the power to address the bencher printers, although the truth is our bencher printers don't include it for the most part. And even like NCSY doesn't include it in their bencher. And his plea though to sort of officially end this custom, he calls it a custom, and as a custom, while there are different categories of customs and how you eliminate them, it's not a problem to eliminate this. We don't want to somehow Shir Hamalot 126 on Shabbat works. It works for us. But we don't want to make it part of our daily liturgy. But having had the experience, made myself study this psalm, of which I really never sat down and studied as a whole, I do agree that we should learn it, that there is what to teach from this one, as well as learning Shir Hamalot, which we take for granted that we understand. So that's the formal end. And anybody, I'm going to stay on if there's any questions, but I know we're running late. So, if you have any questions or comments, put them out there. And if you've had enough and you want to say goodnight, just wave and sign off.
I studied 126 with Nechama Leibovich when I was at university. And she talked about a Christian commentator who is also an anti-Semite. And she explained to us what the afikim in the Negev are, the flash floods that come, and how ignorant this man was, because he was saying, that cursed Israel, this is what salvation is going to be like for them, as if there could ever be rain in that barren desert. And she said, in her inimitable way, the hanes habilti efshari hazeh koreh lanu kol shana v'shana ba'aretz. This impossible miracle happens to us every single year in Israel. It's one of the main things that I remembered that she spoke about. And the thing is, when I was just thinking about it this evening, during your class, this guy must have been like, out for the count, in that there's other places in the Tanakh where the afikim are referenced. I mean, it's in Shir HaShirim, it's elsewhere in Psalms. It's mentioned in Psalm 42. There could be others. Those are just two that come to mind because I've been in touch with those texts. But it's like it's commonplace in our texts, and this guy was just
right. So I really didn't get a chance to address the whole question of the farmer sowing with tears and weeping with joy. And of course, Debbie Friedman wrote a beautiful setting of that verse, and it is for me one of the nigunim, one of the verses that I sing when I'm troubled, and when I'm lost, but the whole connection between sowing and tears, right? That's what Martin Cohn talked about with the sort of the historical, like, what is God's hand in this, and are tears necessary? But the usefulness of the afikim, though, as an agricultural, right? The afikim in the desert do allow things to grow, but you really can't plant dependable crops there. And part of what we need in this cycle is to be able to depend on them. So it really gets increasingly complicated. Any other comments or thoughts, Jerry?
Yeah, just so the end, the farmer sowing and reaping in joy. So it reminds me almost every time I do it, recite it, sing it. One of my favorite Psalms is Psalm 30. And the end of Psalm 30, you have turned my sorrow into dancing, you've sackcloth clothed me with joy, so that my soul will sing to you and not be silent. And this sense that that things are precarious, but it's this great sense that the future is hopeful, that the future will be positive, and I find that very nourishing, both in Psalm 30 and at the end of this psalm.
Right. That's a lovely connection as well. And of course, tears linger. Anger comes for a moment, but then comfort comes. A sense of
Comes in the
time,
morning.
sort of the time of again, almost like the dreamers, right? That time is kind of fluid, or some things are shorter and some things are longer. Even if when we're in the middle of them, they feel long. Yeah. Anything else?
So Stephanie, I found in one of my ventures that it does include Al Naharot Bavel, said to be sung on weekdays.
Yeah, who's the publisher?
So that's what I'm getting ready to read. Israel Observer Publications, nevarich.co.il.
Yeah, it's in many, and I was actually surprised more which Orthodox ventures didn't have it, and it's more and more. That's what's interesting. But if you go back, Mark went back, and actually, I guess his mom's not on anymore. But we had some of the, we looked at some of the books that came from his grandfather, who came from Poland and who was a very educated Jew, and they don't even have Shir HaMalot before benching. Right? Look at some of those old 1920s not benchers, but the Sidorim don't have it. Right? It apparently it was actually a custom that wasn't followed even for Shir HaMalot in some cases. Right? And what I didn't say, because I didn't have a chance to research it, that second paragraph that we now say, or third paragraph, whatever, it says some add, and that is in many of our benches, is actually an anti-Zionist addition that was recited by people who thought Shir HaMalot was in our modern history was too Zionist, and they wanted something that was more about God doing whatever God wants when God gets to it, rather than, oh, God has already brought us back, which is one reason that Mark and I don't sing it anymore. Now I have to go research that history again, and I didn't want to do it because it's not a song. But even 126 is not as universally printed in Sidorim as you might have thought. Hertz, which is an English, England English Siddur, authorized Siddurs, doesn't have it. Going back to the 1940s. Actually, it has Shir HaMalot, but it doesn't have 137. So it's not a new thing not to include 137, or politically correct thing not to include it. It has a long, interesting history of who does and who doesn't include it.
So now I understand why somebody was reading somewhere that one should not sing Tehillat Hashem. And
if you're Zionist.
Yeah, he said, like, what's wrong? It's a nice, it's a nice sentiment. But so why should anybody be saying don't? So now if it's seen as an anti-Zionistic thing, then
I have to go back. I have to really find the sources for that. It's just my recollection. So it's been a long night, and in another month or so, we're meeting, and we'll be doing the Psalms associated with returning the Torah to the Ark. And it was actually difficult to write a little piece for Jerry and decide, like, the procession to return to the Ark. I feel like we don't do that right now. So I was trying to figure out how to write that without writing it.
Well, it's future oriented, Stephanie.
It is future oriented, and it will be fascinating. It will be interesting, and I do have to look at the history of that. But this was much harder than I expected. But thank you for the opportunity to prepare it, because it was also much richer than I expected. And if I learned anything new about like how it actually got, right, how they got from Zohar, like think of something to these particular Psalms. That's what I don't actually have. If I do, I'll let you know. So good night to everyone, and
Good night. It was very enlightening.
be well.
Good night.
Bye.
Well done, Shikochech.
Thank you.
Night.
Good night, Sharon.
Night, Stephen.
Okay, I'm ending for all.